I'm like a fanboy of Dr. White because when he pops stuff up on social media and it's about Winona Lake, he can make anything interesting. And you feel like a good historian, it feels like he's watching, like he's there, observing, taking notes. And that's what it feels like when he does history.
Well, thank you.
So I'm excited to have him here.
I'm a native of Pennsylvania, and I came to the Warsaw-Winona Lake area to college. I came to Grace College way back when it was very, very young. But we lived here 17 years. I taught school for a while and did grad work. And then we moved away, lived 25 years in Washington, D.C. and in Minneapolis. And then in 2003, we moved back here again. Most of my background is in music or journalism. I have degrees in both, and so I've been teaching both of those. And the nice young gal who brought me down here told me she was a violinist, so we had a nice conversation because I've been the chairman of the Symphony of the Lakes for a while, and so we had a nice little conversation about music in the community here. My interest in the history of Winona Lake goes back a long way, but I didn't do anything about it until about 10 years ago. And I discovered about 10 years ago that we were coming up on an anniversary of the incorporation of the town of Winona Lake. It became a town, or it was founded in 1881, but it was incorporated in 1913. Well, we're coming up on 2013. And so I started asking around, is anybody doing anything about it? Are they doing any celebration? And nobody was. And so we planned a year's worth of activities, and I started collecting material to update the history, which hadn't been updated for about 50 years. And the result of all that was that I ended up doing this book, which is on your blackboard there. It's called Winona at 100, Third Wave Rising. And the idea behind the Third Wave Rising is that there are kind of three distinct periods in the town's history, and we're in the third one, and it's not over yet. It continues. Lots of good stuff is happening. But most of my life I've been a journalism or a music teacher, and so I don't lay any claim to being a historian. But I like to tell stories, and I like to find stuff out about the history. So I'm in the History Center in the Westminster Hall a couple days a week, and I do a lot of lectures and tours and try to make things interesting. One of the nice things is that there's a long history of gospel Christian music that is associated with Winona Lake, and I've been playing piano in church ever since I was like in the third grade. So I can play a lot of the hymns, and so I end up doing a lot of programs on that. And so should you ever have an interest in Homer Rodeheaver and the history of gospel music, I can help you out a little bit. My assignment today was to talk about the history of Winona Lake, and I've entitled this little slide presentation Winona Lake at 100 and Counting, because the 100 years was in 2013, but we kept on counting, and we're still going. You will see an eagle on the banner here because the name of the lake was originally Eagle Lake, and there wasn't any town. Warsaw was founded first because it was on kind of high ground. It was founded actually in the 1850s, but the area out where Winona Lake is now was swampy and not very nice land, and so there was no settlement there until three brothers from Germany came down through Goshen. Their names were Beyer, B-E-Y-E-R, and they decided that they would like to have this property along Eagle Lake shore. The reason was they were in the butter and cream and dairy business, and they saw these artesian wells and springs that were popping out of the hillside, and they said, we can build spring houses over that and use that to cool our product. And so they bought 160 acres along the shores of Winona Lake, of what is currently the town of Winona Lake, and they began to establish their business. I indicated that there are three main periods in the town's history. That's my division, but it divides very nicely. The first was when the Beyer brothers started in 1881 and began to develop Eagle Lake as a town on the shores of Eagle Lake. And they called it Spring Fountain Park, because after a couple of years they realized it had some recreational potential, and so they started building things like slides down into the water, and I'll show you some of the stuff that they built. And people started to come, and then they also became a Chautauqua Center. Now the Chautauqua movement was very big in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was named for a lake in New York called Chautauqua. And the idea behind it was that if you lived in a big city like Boston or New York or Chicago, you could go see a Shakespearean play, or you could go to a good museum, or you could go hear lectures or symphony orchestras. But if you lived in rural Indiana, you were out of luck, because none of that was out there. So this organization formed little centers all over the United States. There were 350 of these Chautauqua centers. Most of them were in small towns. Most of them used tents or existing auditoriums. And these celebrities and speakers and musicians would go on a circuit and would travel around and would perform at all these places. Well, Winona Lake became very, very popular as a Chautauqua Center, and in fact, some people have said it has become the second largest after the original one in New York. And some of the people that played or that performed here in Winona Lake are names that you would recognize, like John Philip Sousa and his band. The New York Philharmonic Orchestra played here under Walter Damrosch, all sorts of Metropolitan Opera people, and then explorers like Admiral Perry, and aviation pioneers like Glenn Curtis, and social reformers like Jane Addams, and poets like Paul Dunbar, and all kinds of politicians and all kinds of famous people spoke here. And some summers there were as many as 250,000 people in Winona Lake over the summertime. Only 500 people lived there. And they all came on the train, and it just was really a hot spot for culture and for learning and for music and for literary figures. So that was the first period. The second period then occurred starting in 1894. There were a man named Saul Dickey, who was in southern Indiana, and he was the head of Presbyterian church planting for the Presbyterian Church. He was looking for a property that he could buy and turn into a religious retreat center. And he had bought a property over in Stark County on a lake over there, and that sale fell through. But he bumped into one of the Beyer brothers on the train and told him what he was looking for. And the Beyer brothers said, well, we've got Spring Fountain Park and we're willing to sell. And so this man, Saul Dickey, got together with some of his friends who were rich and famous. You'll know some of the names like John D. Rockefeller and H.J. Hines and John Studebaker and John Wanamaker and various other ones. And they put all their money together and they bought this whole town, 160 acres. Changed the name immediately to Winona Lake, changed the name of the lake to Winona Lake, and began building. And so the big buildings that you see out there in Winona Lake now, like the Westminster Hotel and Mount Memorial and some of those big buildings, the canal, the Killarney Castle, they were all built in those first 5 years of the 1900s. And little by little, they kept the Chautauqua programs going, but little by little they began to add a week of Bible conference and then a second week and a third, until eventually Winona Lake became known as the home of the world's largest Bible conference. And so that was the second period of the town's history. Over the years, it began to decline. Some of the buildings got old and kind of run down. People now had cars instead of all coming on the train. They didn't want to come and stay for a week at a time. And so the Bible conference sort of waned in its importance. And in 1968, they were facing a lot of debt and were going into actually their third bankruptcy. And so they came to Grace College and Seminary, which by then had grown nicely and was up on the hill, and said, would you just take the whole thing over? All the buildings, 16 acres of land, and about $700,000 worth of debt. My father was on the Grace board at the time, and so he helped make that decision. And Grace did that. And so for about 25 years, Grace operated some of these facilities as rentals. And then the whole thing sort of collapsed in the late 1980s. In fact, the Chicago Tribune ran a story in 1990 and called Winona Lake a slum. And it really was. It was very run down and in not good shape. And just at that time, a young man who was a business student at Grace College began to think, Winona Lake could be restored to its original glory. Maybe not like it once was, but he was a guy who liked to go up to Traverse City and Petoskey, Michigan, and he saw the artists up there and some of the folks who had galleries and lived there, and some of the concessions and restaurants and so on. And so he devised a plan for Winona Lake that would have shops down along the water and would have a couple of world-class restaurants. And his idea was to have a trail that would go up through the woods that you could ride on, and maybe put some sculpture along it. And he had all these dreams, and he and his wife started buying properties and fixing them up, but he didn't have much money. And fortunately, 4 years after he started this, he hooked up with a guy who did have money. That was Dr. Dane Miller, one of the 4 founders of Biomet. And to this point, Dr. Miller and his wife have now put $44 million of their own money into developing the village of Winona that you see out there today. And so the brains for it came from this guy named Brent Wilcoxon, but the money for it came from Dr. Miller and Biomet. And so the third phase of the town's history is what we have today. And of course, along with all of these shops and restaurants came all the festivals that we have, like the Juried Art Fair, the Fat and Skinny Tire Fest, the Oktoberfest, and all of the things that go on out at Winona Lake. So those are the three phases of the town's history in a nutshell. During that first wave, they developed a number of pieces of recreational property. The first building built was the Eagle Lake Hotel. That's the one that's down by the stoplight. They built it in 1888 and brought it in on flat cars. And it's been actually added on to about 5 different times. For a while for many years it was called the Winona Lake Hotel after the name of the town was changed. It is now 24 luxury condominiums that are privately owned, but it's all been restored, as you probably know from driving past it, back to how it looked when it was built back in the 1800s. And they're very particular about having the right windows and the right copper piping and all that sort of thing. That was the first big building that was built. And then, as I indicated, they started building other things. Like out on the island, there was a thing called the Carnahan Military Park, which was a military parade grounds and a racetrack. Garfield Park, which was named for President Garfield, was up a little further to the south. And the reason they called it Garfield Park was because the first running water in Winona Lake came from a pneumatic pumping system that came from President Garfield's farm in Ohio. It was brought here and installed, and so people could now have running water in their cottages. They built a cyclorama, which is a round building with 15,000 square feet of paintings in it. And the paintings were of battles of the Civil War that the veterans from this area would have fought in. Like most of them were in Tennessee or in the Carolinas. And they built a switchback railway, which was a form of a roller coaster that went all the way from the hotel all the way up to 9th Street and back. It was gravity fed. The first one like it was built on Coney Island in New York, and the one that was here was designed to be like that one. They built a toboggan slide down into the water. They built a boathouse, and they had roque courts. Roque is sort of like croquet. They use wickets and so on, but it's in an enclosed area, and you carom the ball off the sides like you would in a billiard game. There still is roque being played. There's a roque tournament or a roque league over in Fort Wayne, and some of their players have come over and told us about the sport of roque. For one Olympiad, it was an Olympic sport, but it only lasted for 4 years. And there were other things, a racetrack, a baseball diamond, and so on. 3 main periods. The Spring Fountain Park, Chautauqua Center, and then the home of the World's Bible Conference. And during those years, a man named Billy Sunday moved here that I'll tell you about. They built the big tabernacle. Grace College and Seminary were founded in 1939. An organization called Youth for Christ was founded here. Billy Graham's ministry was launched from the Rainbow Room of the Westminster Hotel in 1949. And so that's the second period in the town's history. And then from 1968 to the present is the third phase of the town's history. There's the first wave, and these are some of the things that I told you about, the Carnahan Military Park, Garfield Park, and so on. These are the 3 Beyer brothers, Fred and Edward and Christian. The next slide is a colorful shot of one of them. Wouldn't you like to have known this guy? What a champion mustache, huh? Yeah, that's great. And he obviously had been fishing down on the canal somewhere. So that's Fred Beyer, one of the 3 Beyer brothers. And they lived, 2 of the families lived in this house. It's a beautiful mansion. It's actually 2 houses with a courtyard in the middle. And one family lived on one side and the other family lived on the other side. And then the third brother lived on a house that was down on Center Street, about where the Ace Hardware used to be. But this Buyer home has been one of the grand old mansions in Winona Lake ever since the late 1800s. It's now owned and occupied by the fellow who owns the Boathouse Restaurant, but has been at various times a boys' dorm for Grace and various other things. So here's what they built at the entrance to Spring Fountain Park. This is a little entrance building. They put a fence all the way around it, and you had to pay to get in, even if you lived there, but you could buy a season's pass. And so you could go in and out without having to pay every time. That fence lasted until 1930. But this little trolley brought people in from the train station in Warsaw. There were tracks that came down what is now Winona Avenue and McKinley Street. And people would come there. And then there was a light rail railroad that took people up along the lakeshore and dropped them off at the various places where they would stay. And that's why we now have a coffee shop in Winona Lake called the Light Rail Roaster, because it was named for the light rail railroad that people used when they took their luggage and stuff up to the places where they would stay. Toboggan slide down into the lake was very popular. This is the Eagle Lake Hotel, which, as I indicated, has been modified a number of times and was actually built in 5 different segments over the years. It's the oldest of the 3 grand hotels, well, actually 4 grand, one of them's been burned down, but there were 4 hotels eventually, and this was the first and the grandest of them in the beginning. This one is called the Minnewawan Inn. It was built in the 1880s, and it housed the horse groomers and jockeys that took care of the horses on the racetrack and the military parade grounds. It was eventually bought by the Assembly and was turned into a 230-room hotel. It's in what is now the parking lot for the Cerulean Restaurant. And so if you are in the light rail roaster and going south, that big parking lot that's there, this is where the inn sat. It was intentionally burned down in 1971 because it was falling apart, and I'll show you some pictures of the fire a little bit later in the slideshow. This is the cyclorama that had the 15,000 square feet of paintings. Originally, they were paintings of the Civil War battles at Chickamauga and Lookout Mountain, but when this became the home of the world's largest Bible conference, they thought that wasn't really appropriate, and so they put up pictures of Jesus and from the Bible. But eventually that was torn down, and then where the cyclorama was is where they built the building that became the Billy Sunday Tabernacle. It was a 7,500 seat tabernacle that sat on a big field. Nobody knows really what happened to the water. The water isn't there now. I mean, it looks like there's a pond or a lake or something, but where the building is located now is all dry land, and I assume it has all been filled in. This is a roque court. You can see the wickets here. If you play croquet, you know what that means. And this is the border that they used to carom the ball off of. This was a very popular sport, along with tennis and some of the other things. Teams came from Europe and Korea to play roque in Winona Lake. They had a racetrack and a military parade grounds out around what is now the island. Back then, the canal hadn't been cut, and so it wasn't really an island. It was just a peninsula that stuck out there. The canal was actually dredged in 1902, and since then we refer to it as the island. This is the switchback railway, or this is a switchback railway. The actual one from Winona Lake is this one, and you can see it's gravity fed. The car would loop like this down to the hotel, would switch over, that's why it's called a switchback, and then it would come back this way. And so that lasted until sometime in the 1930s, we think, is when it was torn down. It came almost over to the 9th Street Hill. Very popular. Here were some of the people and performers who were at the Chautauqua programs in Winona Lake. You'll recognize a number of them. Admiral Byrd, William Jennings Bryan was a presidential candidate, 3-time secretary. He was a Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He was the most popular Chautauqua speaker. Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, but she spoke, she lectured and came with her interpreter. Mrs. George Pickett was very popular. Her husband ran Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, and she was a very popular speaker. And then some of these folks, like Will Rogers, was a well-known writer. He wrote an interesting article about a man named Homer Rodeheaver who lived on Winona Lake. He played trombone. The name of his article was There's a Holy Trombone in Winona Lake. And in it, he talked about Rodeheaver's house, which had a 23-foot slide that went from the roof down into the lake. And so many people read that article and came to see the house. They were afraid the house was going to cave in. So they took the slide off the house The house is still there, the slide is not, and the reason is because of the article that this guy wrote and so many people came to see it. Here are some of the others, opera people like Bela Kersey, John Philip Sousa, who was famous for his band. Colonel Herbert Petrie, you might know that name. He is the one who founded the wagon wheel. And his wife actually taught at Warsaw High School. She was English, I think. And then James Whitcomb Riley, the poet, lived here in Warsaw for a while. And if you go to the library, up into the Indiana room, you can see a sign that he painted for an organization called Phillipson's Department Store. He tried to make money on the side as a sign painter when he couldn't make a living at his writing. This is Saul Dickey, the gentleman who is considered to be the founder of Winona Lake. And as I indicated, in 1894, he bought the entire town and changed the name to Winona Lake and began making it into a Bible conference. Here are some of the dates. The town was renamed in 1895. One of the first buildings that was built was the administration building, and that's where Sim Financial is now, with the big columns out front. And then the Swiss Terrace, these were 3 houses up on the hill that all had Swiss names. The canal was dredged in 1902, and it was paid for by a man named Alexander McDonald, who was the president of Standard Oil of Kentucky, and so it has always been called McDonald Island. When he dredged the island, he dredged it and also all around the periphery of it, and he took that dirt and put it on the island, and it raised the level of the island 4 feet. The island had been swampy. One man who was clearing it and cutting trees recorded that he killed 22 rattlesnakes in one day on the island. His name was Al Cuffle. And when they put this dirt on the island, this raised it by 4 feet, then that made it possible to put in a sewage system and divide it up into lots. And the very first lot on the island that had a house was Killarney Castle. And that was Mr. Saul Dickey's personal residence. So today, if you go out around Esplanade and come around the island, you see this big white Irish castle, and it looks so out of place architecturally, but that was Saul Dickey's home, and it was the first building that was built on the island. Here's the canal. Up until 1902, that wasn't there. There's no reason for the canal other than cosmetic. They just wanted more waterfront and places to park their boats, and so they cut the canal. And Homer Rodeheaver's home, Rainbow Point, is right about over here, and Killarney Castle is right out here on the point. And so there are a number of things that occurred on the island. Some of them I'll mention. The main drag, Park Avenue, is right here, and so this is kind of the heart of Winona Lake right here. This was the main Bible conference area, and then up on top of the hill are Mount Memorial and the Westminster Hotel, and then Grace College campus is out this direction. These are some of the people who, along with Saul Dickey, put their money into buying Winona Lake. John Studebaker, of course, was from the Studebaker family that built wagons and automobiles. H.J. Hines from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You know him for pickles, ketchup, and relish, but he was an art collector, and he brought 14 pieces of art from around the world to Winona Lake. He brought carved lions stone lions from Beijing, a lot of statues from Italy and France. All of those have been taken back by the Hines family or foundation except for one. One piece remains. It's in the island at the foot of the 9th Street Hill. It's called The Student. He's holding up his rolled up newspaper like this, has a little satchel over his shoulder. That statue was created by Jean Turcan, a colleague of Auguste Rodin, the great sculptor who did The Kiss and The Thinker, and it came to Winona Lake in 1894 from Paris. It's probably the most valuable piece of artwork that we have in Winona Lake, but it's out there in the wind and rain. Some people think we should put a mock-up out there and bring the real one inside to protect it. There are lots of stories about that statue. It shows up in all the early postcards and all the early photos. They always had the student in the picture. And so every time you see a picture of a lily pond or anything, the statue is there because that was sort of the identifying piece of artwork for Winona Lake. Well, they built a train station. This is up back of the, if you're at the stoplight and look to the left, there's a building there called the Arcade, which has some kind of rounded windows. Well, if you look carefully, there are stone steps behind that and a retaining wall, and this train station was up on top of that. And so the train station would stop there, and then the 1902 castle, the Killarney Castle, was built out on the island. Over the years, it's been a number of things. It's been offices, it's been a theater, it's been apartments. It's now owned by a private family that live there. If you take a look carefully at the house, beside this door, there's a little brass plate there, and it's about this height. There's a little mark, and it says high water mark. Don't believe it. It's a fake. The water has never ever been that high. It has once in a while gotten up to the front steps, but the water in Winona Lake never got as high as that. And so the people that live there have a good time with it. They're the same people that run the mercantile down at the boathouse. The Daguerre building was named for a Frenchman named Daguerre, who essentially invented the photographic process. And this building was given early on to a group of professional photographers, and they began a summer school called the Winona School of Professional Photography. Had nothing to do with the Bible conference, nothing to do with anything else. It was just a summer school. And so year after year, world famous photographers would come here and study at the Daguerre building. There's an interesting story that occurred in 1947 down over the hill. This is up on the hill now, up on College Avenue, but down over the hill on Park Avenue in 1947, there was a water heater that blew up, and it just almost destroyed a couple of houses. It blew out 31 windows, and the canister for that hot water heater shot up in the air and arced over and dropped down through the roof of this building. And so when the custodian of the Daguerre building in the spring came to open it up and get ready for the summer classes, he found this water heater canister in his building. And it took me a long time to track down the actual date on when that happened. And this is one of those odd little stories. Now, the Daguerre building was torn down a few years ago, but they built another building, which is still existing, for the Winona School of Photography. This building was built in 1956. And this had an auditorium in it that had a revolving stage. And so it had this rotating stage where they could have sets and models and so on, and it would turn around. And they also had darkrooms that were up on where the old dairy used to be. It's now the Grace Physical Plant. The Winona School of Photography sold this property, and ultimately it came into the hands of Winona Lake Grace Brethren Church. And now it's called the Hub, and on that corner, and it is kind of the youth center for the church. But for many years, it was the School of Photography. I used to teach a photojournalism workshop at the School of Photography, and we would use the dark rooms up in the Haney Dairy area. The Mount Memorial School it's always been a school. There have always been schools in it, but it's named Mount Memorial not because it's up on a hill. It has nothing to do with that mount. It's named for Governor James Mount. That was the guy's name, and he died in 1902. He died about 3 days after he left office, but the building was named for him. And it's housed a number of schools over the years. Between 1900 and 1920, there were 8 different schools in Winona Lake. There was a technical school, there was an agricultural school, there was a conservatory of music, there were a couple of what they call normal schools. And these schools all disappeared by 1920, but the students all took classes in this building or in the Westminster. And so it's, as I indicated, it's always been a school. And this is the Westminster Hotel, built in 1905. The cornerstone says the Presbyterian building, but it's always been called Westminster Hall until the Free Methodists located their denomination there in 1935. They bought this building and changed the name of it to the International Friendship House. But when they left town in 1990, it reverted back to becoming Westminster again. It's now, and has been for a number of years, a Grace College dormitory. Upper two floors house girls. The center floor is a conference center, and then the basement has 2 restaurants in it. There's a Chipotle-style restaurant and a Subway down there, and a commuter lounge, and so on. In this building, there was a publishing house for gospel music, and it was one of the largest gospel music publishers in the world. It was done by a fellow named Homer Rodeheaver, whose name will come up a number of times, but Homer bought this hotel in 1941, located his business there, and owned it over a number of years until it eventually went into ownership by Grace College. Here's the Swiss Terrace, 3 buildings all hooked together, the Geneva, the Lucerne, and the Interlaken, and this was one of the most popular places for people to rent when they came to the summer conferences. The Lucerne no longer exists, but the Interlaken is this big double, it's got 2 sides to it, 2 different families live in it, and then the Geneva is a little bit down the road. That Swiss Terrace was one of the first housing areas. In fact, the house that's clear at the end was lot number 1. That was the first piece of housing that was built in Winona Lake. The Merbank is a house that's out on the island. If you go out on Administration Boulevard and before you turn left, you come to the Merbank. believe what you want about this, but the story behind it is that there was an industrialist who fell in love with the daughter of the lady who ran the Swiss Terrace. Her name was Nell Cooper. And this gentleman built this house for his bride-to-be, put the finest of carpets in it and furniture, had a beautiful piano in it that he kept tuned and all that. But Mrs. Cooper's husband died, and the daughter had to help her mother take care of the properties they had, and so they never ever got married. This poor guy would come all the time to visit, and they would go down to the house, but then she would go back and be with her mother. Well, there was a baby involved. The baby's name was Chloe, and out on the internet you can find a novel written by Sherry Benyuski called The Lost Chloe that was subsidized from Indiana Arts and Humanities Council, and she wrote this novel about the lost Chloe. Chloe had a nanny named Phoebe, and Phoebe has become the town ghost, and she lives in the Murbrink. The Murbrink has never had a full-time resident. It's only had summertime residents. But there are lots of stories. There's a local photographer named Al Disbrow, and he tells stories about taking pictures of the house, and Phoebe's upstairs and she's waving at him, and when he developed the film, she wasn't there. She was just a ghost. And one of the guys who owned the house was out fishing early in the morning, and he came around the point in his boat, and his wife waved to him from the porch, and when he came in, he said, "Why were you out so early?" She said, "I wasn't out early. It was Phoebe the ghost." So that's the town. That's one of the town ghosts. There's also one named Mike who lives up back of the OCC on the railroad, and when it's foggy, you can see him waving his lantern up there. He was hit by a train and killed. But there are several ghost stories that go with Winona Lake, and one of the best ones is the story about Phoebe, and you could read about her on the internet if you'd like. This is Chandra Khan, and this is the statue that I referred to, the student, and as I indicated, it's one of the best known. Here it is on the front cover of my book, the student, and it just was always the thing that identified Winona Lake in photographs. Well, these were some of the schools that existed during those 20 years between 1900, and one of them, the Winona Technical Institute, was actually on the old Armory property down in Indianapolis, and it is now called Tech High School. It's the only state-owned high school in Indiana, and I think it has about 2,500 students. It's a very well-known and very popular high school, but it was started by the Winona Lake Bible Conference. The biggest tragedy in town was the Great Fire of 1914. Some guys were out, it was in April, and some guys were out raking leaves in the yard of the Winona Hotel and burning them, and the sparks caught fire and began to blow, and they started catching nearby houses on fire, and so the fire started racing up Chestnut Street. They couldn't get it stopped. There was a very poor fire department. There wasn't really a fire department, they just had a little bit of equipment, and so they were very ineffective. And so to try and get the fire out, they decided they would dynamite houses in front of the fire as it was marching up Chestnut Street. So they blew up 2 of those houses, and unfortunately one of them was in the process of being sold, and so a poor gentleman named Mr. Newland went to his attorney's office and gave them a check for $9,000 for this property, and when he got to Winona Lake, all he had was a pile of ashes. That gentleman had some bad luck, because later on his son was killed on his bicycle while he was delivering newspapers. The pastor of the Presbyterian Church backed out of his garage and hit him. But this gentleman that owned the house ended up just with a pile of ashes. But this fire raced up Chestnut Street, and it destroyed almost everything in its path. And this house at the corner of 5th and Chestnut became known as the house that stopped the fire, because it was made of cement block and it didn't burn. And so there's a film actually by an insurance company called The House That Stopped the Fire, and it features that house. But as the fire raced up there, they decided to call or to telegraph over to Fort Wayne and say, send firefighters. And so they sent a trainload of firefighters along with a pumper, and here they are arriving at the Winona Lake Railroad Station, and they went out on the dock in front of the hotel, began to pump water out of the lake, pumped it up onto the fire, and eventually got the fire out. The fire, according to the New York Times, caused about $100,000 worth of damage. This was in 1914, and I figured out what that would be worth in today's dollars, and it was $2.65 million. And nobody was killed in the fire, although one of the firemen had a heart attack. There were several people that were treated for smoke inhalation, but that fire of 1914 wiped out the entire, all the way down Chestnut Street. And if you're standing at 4th and 5th Street and looking down toward the Winona Hotel here on the left. Everything on this side was wiped out. And so everything on that street is new since the 1914 fire. Ever hear of the Yellowstone Trail? It was the first transcontinental highway. It preceded the Lincoln Highway by a couple of years, and it came right through Winona Lake. It started out on the east coast at Plymouth Rock, and it came across, went through Yellowstone Park, ended up at Puget Sound in Washington. And so from 1912 to 1930, this was a very popular transcontinental route. It was founded, or was started by a guy named Parnley, J.W. Parnley, who was from Ipswich, South Dakota. And today there is a Yellowstone Trail Association that you can join, and they have a newsletter and all that sort of thing. I recently wrote a book, or wrote an article called when the Yellowstone Trail met the Sawdust Trail, because the Yellowstone Trail came within about 2 blocks of Billy Sunday's home. He was known for the Sawdust Trail. I'll speak about that in a moment. But they had a relay race in 1915 that went from Washington, D.C. all the way out to the West Coast. And they had Packards and Buicks that carried this packet of materials from Washington, D.C. All the way out to the West Coast, and they would trade off. This transcontinental highway had literature that went with it that told you where you could get tires and where you could get batteries and where you could stay and where you could find a farmer that will pull you out of the mud if you were. It's the old Pierceton Road coming in from Pierceton, came right down Kings Highway, down up Argonne Road, and out 30 through Warsaw. If you go to Christos Restaurant out in Plymouth, you'll see a big sign there that says on the Yellowstone Trail. And the way I found out about it was somebody gave me a receipt for automobile repairs, and it said it was at the Wired Garage, W-I-A-R-D, and the address was in Winona Lake, Indiana on the Yellowstone Trail. And I said, what's the Yellowstone Trail? Well, I began to research it, and I found out here's this whole thing that I didn't know anything about, and so I now have a separate presentation on the Yellowstone Trail. But it started, it's the old 30 that comes along the Pierceton Road and comes right down through Winona Lake, goes out Argonne Road. We're starting to put some signs up. These are the first of 4 signs. This one is on the Pierceton Road, just about at the intersection with Packerton. And so if you want to act real smart, you can explain to your folks sometime what those signs are all about and what the Yellowstone Trail is all about. Well, when it became the home of the World's Bible Conference, which didn't happen right away, but a lot of things happened during that period. And the main one was that a guy named Billy Sunday moved here. Now, Billy Sunday was born in Iowa in 1862. He was poor. His father died 6 months after he was born, so he never knew his father. His mother married some unfortunate people that were abusive, and so he and his brother ended up spending a lot of their childhood in an orphanage, or several orphanages actually. He was sickly. He never was very strong, but he grew up to be a fairly good athlete. He was a great runner. He was pretty fast. And he ended up playing baseball with a group called Marshalltown, is in Marshalltown, Iowa. And from there, he had a tryout with the Chicago White Stockings baseball team. And that was a professional team in the National League. The American League didn't exist yet. And he got a place on this baseball team. And so he played for professional baseball for the Chicago White Stockings for 5 years. That team later became the Cubs. You might think the White Stockings became the White Sox, but they didn't. It was the Cubs because there was only a National League. The American League wasn't founded until 1900. But in 1907, those Cubs won the World Series, and they won again in 1908. And they never, ever again won the World Series until 2016. If you're any kind of a Cubs fan, you know that long dry spell when nobody could ever win the World Series. So I wrote an article not too long ago called "The Cubs Won the World Series and Billy Sunday Just Missed It," because he quit playing shortly before they won the World Series in 1907. But this was the auditorium where the Bible conferences were held. It's white, it's made of wood, and it stands where the current Winona Heritage Room is, right at the foot of the 9th Street Hill. This is what Billy Sunday looked like when he became a preacher. He played baseball for 5 years for the White Stockings, then was traded to the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, played for the Phillies for a little bit. He was offered a huge contract from the Cincinnati Reds. He turned it down and said, no, I think I should be in Christian work. And so he went to work instead for the YMCA in Chicago for $83.33 a month. But when he preached, he was very athletic. He would run and slide and dive. He would climb up on the pulpit. He would crash chairs. We have a chair in our museum in Winona Lake that's split down the middle. It's been glued back together again. And he wrote on the bottom of it, I sat on this chair during such and such a thing. But his way of talking about salvation was, when the great umpire calls that game in the sky, will you be safe at home or will you be out? And what he meant by that, of course, was, would you have salvation? And that was his way of talking about it. He started having his crusades in tents. Then he moved to auditoriums, but eventually he began to be building tabernacles out of wood. So he would go into a community, or his people would. He had 48 people that worked for him. They'd go into a community, find an empty lot. They would buy lumber from the lumber yard and build these tabernacles. And some of them were huge. Some of them seated 10,000, 12,000, 15,000. The one in New York City seated 18,000 people. And he would fill it 3 times a day. He'd preach in the morning, preach again in the afternoon, and preach again at night. And he spoke to more than 100 million people face to face. That means no radio, no television, and no amplification. It was all just acoustic. No other human being has ever done that. And so over his career, he did that 26 different times. He built 26 of these different temporary tabernacles. When the Crusades were over, they'd tear them down, sell the lumber, move on to the next town, and do it all over again. And so it was an enormous operation. If you come to the History Center in Winona Lake, you can see the architectural drawings. Later in life, he always umpired a game out at Winona Lake, and that was very, very popular. But here he is on the right as a player for Chicago. Well, I indicated that the Cubs won the World Series in 2016. When they won in 2016, here's what the Chicago Tribune did for them. They gave them a whole page. But when they won back in 07, all they got was this cartoon. Here is a picture of the scorecard from that World Series when they beat the Detroit Tigers in 07, and as I indicated, or in 08 this was, they won both in 07 and 08. But I got curious. He was known for his running. He could circle the bases from a standing start in 14 seconds, and he could beat all the runners from all the other teams. His lifetime batting average was .248, and I got curious because that's a pretty decent average. So I looked up the 2016 Cubs to see who else had a .250 batting average, and it was 3 guys: David Ross, the guy that's now the manager, Ben Zobrist, the MVP for the World Series, and Dexter Fowler. And so he really was a pretty good batter, but nobody ever gave him credit for that. They just talked about how fast he could run. He built this house in Winona Lake in 1911. He had been coming here to speak regularly, and the crowds got bigger and bigger, and he got more and more popular. So he and his wife decided they wanted to live here instead of downtown Chicago. So he built this house at the corner of 12th Street and Ludlow Avenue. It's now called Sunday Lane. They and their 4 children, they had a daughter and 3 boys, and they built the house, and it's available today to look through as a museum. This is their dining room. I mean, the house is 125 or so years old, and it has all the original occupants' furnishings in it, which is really amazing. Everything in it belonged to the Sundays. In about 1920, this tabernacle was built in a field there in Winona Lake, and later it was named for Billy. It was called the Billy Sunday Tabernacle. It seated 7,500 people and was one of the largest venues in northern Indiana. This is what the interior of it looked like. Billy Sunday is there on the platform. That building lasted from 1920 until 1992, 72 years. But eventually it became too expensive to maintain. It was going to cost $1 million to put a new roof on it. Now they are building an ice rink there. If you've been out to Winona Lake lately, you have seen that is under construction. In the wintertime, when it's cold, it'll have a sheet of ice, and there's warming places and so on. And so I'm sure we're going to see hockey, and we're going to see figure skating. We'll see a lot of stuff happen. But then in the warmer weather, there's a concrete deck there, and it'll be a performance venue. And so orchestras and bands and musicians and so on can perform there. Every evangelist had a song leader who became almost as popular as the evangelist, and for him it was Homer Rodeheaver. He played the trombone, he led choirs, he was a song leader, he became a publisher, and this was his house. This is the 23-foot slide down into the water, and that's the slide that had to be torn down because of the popularity of the newspaper article. His favorite song was "Every Cloud Will Wear a Rainbow If Your Heart Keeps Right," and so he had rainbows everywhere, on his cushions, on his rugs, on his silverware and plates and everything. His house was called Rainbow Point. He owned the hotel, and there's a room called the Rainbow Room. He had a boys ranch in Florida called Rainbow Boys Ranch. And so it all came from that song, "Every Cloud Will Wear a Rainbow If Your Heart Keeps Right." He was the most popular song leader in America, and there are a number of recordings. He also became very rich because he would buy a song. For example, the Old Rugged Cross, a hymn, he bought for $50, and then he published it in a songbook for the Billy Sunday Crusades. But then he took that one song and he published a low voice version, and a medium voice version, and a high voice version, and a ladies trio version, and a men's quartet version, and a choir octavo anthem, and an instrumentation for band, and an instrumentation for orchestra. And then he took that into the recording studio, and between 1920 and 1925 he recorded it 9 different times and sold 1 million copies of the recording of it. So for a $50 investment, imagine the revenue that he made off of that. It's called passive revenue. At one time or another owned almost every large building in Winona Lake. Did you know we had a water skiing lion in Winona Lake?
Yes.
His name was Jerry. You can find him out on the internet. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about it?
No, I don't know that much about it. I just
Okay.
had him.
Well, he was owned by a guy named Paul Lohman. Paul Lohman wasn't a real normal guy. He rode a motorcycle, which back then a lot of people didn't do. He had a professional water skiing troupe, and he did a number of other interesting things. But he got this lion from a circus, and he taught it how to water ski behind boats. And people would come from all over to watch this lion water ski. Well, he only did it for a couple of years, and then the lion went to the great farm in the sky. And he got a second one named Jerry. Jerry was a lot younger, and Jerry was a rascal. He never learned to water ski, and he would get loose, and he would get under people's porches, and he would get up and look in their windows. The arcade building, had a little store in it, and he got in there and trashed it one time. And so Jerry met I'm not sure where he went, but he didn't last very long. So then he got a third lion called Conga, a cub, which started out at about 500 pounds. And we have some pictures of him walking around Winona Lake with this thing on a leash. And when he got ready to leave Winona Lake in 1939 and moved to Orlando, he tried to find someone who would buy it or who would take it as a pet, and he couldn't find anybody who wanted it. So he got a high-powered rifle and shot it and buried it somewhere in Winona Lake. We don't know where. But someday, somebody is going to dig up their garden and they're going to find the bones of this lion, and they're going to say, "What in the world is this?" If you hear somebody that digs it up and wants to know, you now know the story, and you can tell them, "Well, that was Conga the lion." Yeah. So if you really want to know more about this, talk to Connie, the lady who works in the mercantile at the boathouse, because Paul Lohman was her relative, and she can tell you all about Mr. Lohman and some of the things that he did. The second Billy, who's connected with Winona Lake, is Billy Graham. And there are several stories related to that, but the bottom line is that in 1944, a group of guys got together in the Westminster Hotel in the Rainbow Room. They were having dinner, and they decided to form an organization of youth ministries, and they called it Youth for Christ. And the first guy they hired was this lanky young preacher from the west side of Chicago named Billy Graham. He worked for them for 4 years as an evangelist, and then he decided he wanted to enlarge his own ministry. So they had an all-night prayer meeting in the Rainbow Room where they put him in the center of the room, gathered around him, laid hands on him, and prayed that God would do something really special with this young man. And he went off to Los Angeles in September of 1949, and that's where he had the tent crusade that made him famous. It was supposed to be 2 weeks long, but so many people came that they enlarged it to 4 weeks and 6 weeks and 8 weeks. And eventually, that's where William Randolph Hearst, the great publisher, found him, started writing stories about him, and his career took off like a rocket. Well, Youth for Christ would come to Winona Lake every summer for a 2-week convention, and he would come back and speak for it. The last time he spoke in Winona Lake was in 1969. Remember the Billy Sunday Tabernacle that seated 7,500 people? That's where he was speaking. 23,000 people tried to get in to hear him. And so we have stories. There are people that live in Winona Lake now that will tell you that they were up in the rafters and hanging on the roof and looking in through the dormers and all that sort of thing. Here they are in Winona Lake. All sorts of people, famous people, came to Winona Lake. This is that prayer meeting that occurred in 1949 that led to the launch of Billy Graham's ministry. And here was the tent out in Los Angeles. Hundreds of churches, it says, uniting. And as I indicated, it was supposed to be just a couple weeks. They call it the 6th Great Sin-Smashing Week, and it just got larger and larger and larger until finally he became quite famous. Grace Seminary was founded. So the seminary is the Graduate School of Theology. Was founded in 1936 in the little church that's behind the Westminster Hotel. It's called now the Church of the Good Shepherd. It used to be called the Winona Lake Presbyterian Church. The director of the Bible conference said, please keep your seminary here. They said, no, we want to go to Akron, Ohio. So they located in Akron, Ohio for a couple of years. But then eventually they came back to Winona Lake and have been permanent residents there since 1939. And then as the school grew, they decided they needed an undergraduate school to help feed the grad school. So they founded Grace College in 1948, and it became a four-year liberal arts college in 1954. Now there are about 2,300 students total in both schools, but they still have the same president, the same board of trustees, and so on, and about 180-acre campus all on the east side of Winona Lake. This is where they had their first classes in Akron, Ohio, and this is the director of the Bible conference who invited them to bring it to Winona Lake. And when they came to Winona Lake, they had classes in the Mount Memorial Building, and they used the Theological library down where the town park is now at a school called the Winona School of Theology, which had been founded by a British theologian named G. Campbell Morgan. So part of the attraction was this library that they could use, which was only used in the summertime by the School of Theology, and they could use it in the wintertime. In 1951, they decided to build, and here are the students outlining the building that became McLean Hall. That's the building with the white steeple that's right in the center of the Grace campus. When I came to Grace in 1960, there were only three buildings: McLean Hall, Lancer Gym, which has since been torn down, and Phalathea Hall, which they're still using as a classroom building. Now, there's buildings and stuff all over the place for the campus. And then after that, a number of organizations were founded: a home missions, foreign missions, a publishing company, an investment foundation, and all of that became a whole new denomination called the Grace Brethren, which has recently been rebranded. It became the Fellowship of Grace Brethren Churches, and just recently rebranded to be called the Charis Fellowship. Well, the Third Wave Rising, that's the current Winona Lake, has all of these things. I mentioned that Grace College took them over in 1968. My father was on that board. This is my father right here, and he was on the joint board then that operated the Bible conference for a while. I told you about the inn that was built in 1880, and it was housing the. Well, here's when it burned down in 1972. It was getting old and kind of ramshackle, and so they torched it. The village of Winona starts at the Cerulean restaurant, goes down to the Boathouse restaurant, comes around to the Light Rail Roaster, and as you know, there are something like, 14 shops or so. They're all a part of this. Brent Wilcoxon is the guy that had the vision, and Dane and Mary Louise Miller are the ones who had the money to make it happen. Grace took over some of those properties in the 1980s. An organization called the Eskimo Inn, which was a popular ice cream shop across from the Tabernacle, became the Student Union. They called it the Lamp, and it was all torn down. The only one building that remains from the early days is the post office. This is the destruction of the Tabernacle in 1992, and now we have the village of Winona with all the shops. Boathouse and Cerulean, both getting excellent reviews and notice. Biking trails, 160 acres up there, the old Chicago Boys Club property, have all these trails, and as you know, there's a greenway that goes through that has paving, and you can listen to the artists talk about the sculptures that are along it and so on. The MOCC was built in 2007, a joint project between Depew, Synthes, Biomed, and Zimmer, and is now the athletic center. The NCAA championships are being held as we speak. This is the 10th year for them, and also a town gathering place for exhibitions. The Limitless Splash Pad Park is designed for children that may have disabilities. So if you have a wheelchair or so on, or if you're on the autism spectrum or whatever, the park is designed especially for those children to be able to enjoy it. The Greenway just keeps being extended and extended. The most recent piece ended up out at Christ Covenant Church, but under construction right now is the piece that'll go out to Lakeland Christian Academy and then down 250 and go out to Stonehenge. And ultimately this thing will be 17 miles long when they get it all finished, and you'll be able to go from the Chinworth Bridge on one side to Stonehenge on the other. There's what the trail looks like. If you haven't been on the Greenway, it's a real treat. There are sculptures all along it. This particular one was just installed last spring, and it commemorates the Indians who lived here, the Miamis and the Potawatomis, who were the original occupants here before the first white settler came in 1836. There's a a monument to Billy Sunday, this flame. My wife and I donated that. There's a bench, a marker on the bench. It's a memorial to our daughter who died a few years ago. And so all along the trail are those kinds of markers. Grace College has grown, over 2,000 people now. The Winona History Center in the Westminster Hotel is open from 2 to 5 every afternoon except Sunday and Monday, and you're welcome to visit it. Sometimes classes from the high school come. This is what the Billy Sunday home looks like. It's available for touring. And if you really want to know much more about Winona Lake, I have a book that is 354 pages of trivia about Winona Lake. And I tell people there's a warning inside, caution may cause drowsiness. That's about all I can tell you in the time that we have. Do you have questions? Or maybe you'd like to correct something that I didn't get quite right. Yeah.
Why did they put that little brass plate with the water line if it never got there?
Just a joke.
Okay, it was just a joke.
Just to fake people out.
Okay, yeah.
They're just mean.
Yeah, because I was like, I know we've been to Florida and we do a lot of history things when we go places. And I remember, I think it was in Florida, they had a whole bunch of them, the water lines, when it got really bad. So it's I've seen them before, and I was like, I don't think I've ever seen that.
Well, if you drive real slowly around the point, you can see this
it.
up there on the house. Just don't believe it.
Okay.
Do you know when Lakeview was put by over there?
The school?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when it was built. It was the high school before it was a middle school. It was here in the 60s when I was here as a student. So it goes back a ways. By the way, that's one of the ways people came to Winona Lake was through those canals that are behind Lakeview. And they would get off the train station, and there was a boat that would take them out there and out into the lake, and then it would dock at the Winona Hotel. There was also a little trolley, light rail. Trolleys first, and a light railroad that brought people in from there. There's one question that a lot of people ask that you haven't, and that is why did they change the name, and where did the name come from? It's a long story. But the bottom line is that I told you about the guy that bought the property over in Stark County, and that sale fell through. Well, there's a little town called Winona over there on Bass Lake, and the town of Winona was inside the property that he bought, and he had stock certificates printed and had his registration with the Secretary of State and all that for the Winona Assembly and Summer School that he was going to put over there in Stark County. When the sale fell through, and they came to Spring Fountain Park, and they bought Eagle Lake, he decided it was easier to change the name of the town than it was to change his paperwork. So he changed the name of the town. There was already a Winona, so now it's Winona Lake. And so the Winona Assembly and Summer School had all of its stock certificates and all of its registration with the Secretary of State, and all he had to do was change the name of the town and the lake. So he did.
So the Princess Winona, was that from the other lake then?
Well, the Princess Winona is a figment of somebody's imagination. There was a little girl named Anna Haymaker that they put a feather in her hair and took her picture, and she became Princess Winona. Some people say that, there is a Princess Winona in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Hiawatha. But the truth is, the real story is that he changed the name of the town to suit his stock certificates.
Dear.
Well, you've been very patient to listen to all of this. Thank you for your attention. I invite you to visit the Winona History Center, and if I can answer any questions for you, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Food sold to a preacher or a high school girl has the same effect as when it's sold to an automobile thief or a horse thief. Congress has passed a law putting $2 a tax on whiskey, and they expect to realize $300 million. That means that the American people have got to buy and drink 150 million gallons a year. They have put $5 a barrel tax on beer. That means the people have got to buy and drink 32 million barrels of beer a year. It doesn't take a lawyer to figure out that if you do that, you take that much money out of legitimate channels of trade. You spend that much less for food and clothes and boots and shoes and education and automobiles. Oh, America didn't need repeal. She needed repentance. She didn't need rum. She needed righteousness. We don't need jags. We need Jesus. We don't need more drop. We need more of God.
In Winona Lake, Indiana, not far from the tabernacle that bears his name, is his house. A veritable museum of tokens of esteem from the mightiest and the least. On the wall of his study are signed portraits of the great men of his time: Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Teddy Roosevelt, Cecil B. DeMille, General Pershing, the Mayo brothers. And the room is filled with mementos from some of the thousands of people who shed tears at his departure from their town. A clock from the employees of Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. Trophies and loving cups, one given him by the chauffeurs of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Another clock from the Pittsburgh Pirates. Gifts given to Billy Sunday from the people whose language he spoke, the people of the country he loved. Billy's preaching at the height of his popularity was never captured on film because talking pictures were not invented until 20 years afterward. By that time, he was no longer the handsome young man of the spectacular campaign. But in this rare film, we can still catch a glimpse of his style of preaching and his way with an audience as he presents his reasons for the Christian support of Prohibition.
Present to all you good friends today, Mr. Billy Sunday, the man who has spoken to more people than any other man who has ever lived. And we invite you to join with this great crowd here at Winona in this great day we're having. Mr. Sunday.
Folks, I'm going to talk to you a little while this afternoon on the 18th Amendment. The Prohibition Amendment is the most popular thing, my friend, in American today. What means this is all against the 18th Amendment and the Constitution? It's an attempt on the part of the old brewers and the old distilleries and the old saloon keepers and the old bartenders and the whiskey politicians and newspapers to bind and rivet the breweries around the neck of the American people again for their own profit. Their arguments against prohibition are as weak as soup made out of the scat of a chicken that starved there. When you compare prohibition at its worst with the saloon at its best, prohibition's a million times better. And the ills you would fly to by repeating the 18th Amendment are 1,000 times worse than the ones you'd fly from by leaving it, my friend, as it is. Oh, I know that great anti-prohibition volcano in the United States, aroused and directed by the enemies of prohibition and Americanism, is vomiting forth its political labyrinth and corruption in a current that's broad and deep and wide and speaking with frightful destruction over our land, and bidding fair to leave no office, shop, store, factory, farm, school, or college that is not scarred by its damnable blight, while riding upon its bosom like the demons of hell are the political enemies, taunting and sneering and jeering at those that dare resist its damnable blight. I may be crushed by it, but bow to it I never will. Oh, history tells us many free countries have lost their liberty. America may lose hers. If she does, my proudest boast will be not that I was the last to desert it, but that I never deserted it. There's no neutral ground in this track. It's war to the knife and knife to the hilt. I absolutely refuse to vote for any man, for mayor, for governor, for representative, for senator, or for president, who is hostile to and will not openly support the 18th Amendment or all other amendments, no matter what political party. No matter what political party he may belong to, it will not openly support the 18th Amendment or any other amendment of the Constitution. Someone said to me the other day, oh, prohibition interferes with my personal liberty. Personally, every law in the statute book interferes with the liberty of the crook that wants to break it. It don't interfere with my liberty because I keep it. The shepherd tears the keeper wolf away from the throat of the sheep for which the keeper is thankful. And then the wolf complains against the shepherd for interfering with his personal liberty. Another said to me the other day, oh, prohibition is responsible for the depression. Oh, it's worldwide. Then if it's worldwide, what caused it in the other nations? What causes the depression in Germany? What caused it in England, where they've had 3 million men on dole ever since the war, and America's the only dry nation in the world? It's because the world is an inheritance from the war. That's why. Fellow said to me, oh, prohibition makes bootleggers and rum runners and moonshiners. Oh, we had bootleggers and moonshiners when we were under the British flag. For 155 years, the stars and stripes have waved over America. We've had bootleggers and we have them now. Like a fellow wrote to a doctor and said, dear doctor, I had a wart on my face and weighed 1.5 pounds. After taking 12 bottles of your medicine, my face is gone, but the wart is there yet. Well, the saloons are gone, the brewers are gone, the distillers are gone, but the bootlegger and the moonshiner, my friend, he's here yet in this thing. Fellas said, well, we're drinking more whiskey and poison whiskey. If so, why is the death rate in America as less than it's ever been in the history of the United States? Oh, will briars and thorns and thistles cause the wheat fields to produce more and better wheat? Is the vegetable around good nourishment for the Savior? Will a lightning bolt throw the tree in more delicate verdure? Is fire good, my friend, to increase the aroma and the beauty, my friend, of the rose? I said to me, well, they don't keep it, we'll repeal it. All right, then repeal the 18th of the 10 Commandments. They don't keep the 10 Commandments. They lie, they steal, they commit adultery, they murder, and yet you know without the 10 Commandments there'd be no civilization. You know that society and civilization rests on morals. Morals rest on religion. Religion rests on faith in God and in Jesus Christ. Over the Mexican border, 1,500 miles long, and the Canadian border, 3,000 miles long, and the Atlantic and the Pacific border, 5,000 miles long, and Cuba, and Bermuda just next door, and the most thoroughly organized gang of subs and cutthroats on the hung on this side of hell. It's no easy job, I want to tell you. A leading lawyer in Chicago said the other day that 90% of the rum runners, the hijackers, the bootleggers, my friends, and the riffraff of the earth, they are born of foreign parents. And that 70% of them have never been naturalized. I say deport every unnaturalized law person. I say take away the citizenship papers from every man that's been naturalized when he shows himself a crook. And on second offense, deport him also. America's going to be run by Americans, cost what it will. And whenever a man, I accept, my friend, and stand with open arms, welcome any man from any country. But when they leave the foreign land and come to America to build homes and rear their families and live under the protecting folds of the Stars and Stripes, they alter themselves in the land of their adoption. They leave their damnable Indian ideas back across to see where they came from. America is no place for a descender to live in. And there's no place beneath the Stars and Stripes for the arm that will not be descended and for the heart that doesn't love it in the world. No.